Welcome back, everyone. Now it's time for the second round of panel discussions. Panel 2A will look at technology and human nature. And the topic of panel 2B is anxiety in international relations caused by the progress of science and technology. These two sessions will also take place simultaneously on Channel A and Channel B. Now, let me introduce the organizers of these sessions. HASIDA Koiti, professor in the Graduate School of Information Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo, and SUZUKI Kazuto, professor in the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. Great to have you both with us today. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Now, Professor Suzuki, can you give us a brief introduction of your session?
Right. When we talk about science and technology and the progress of it, people tend to have this sort of a positive image, but at the international relations, there is always difficulties because these technologies can be used for the military purpose as well. So our panel is going to discuss about how this nature of the technology to contribute to the anxiety among the states and among the people in the society about the threat of war and how to prevent the war.
Very important topic to maintain peace in the world.
Right.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Suzuki will move to another room to prepare for his session. Thank you, Professor Suzuki. Please stand by. Now, Professor Hashida, what will be the main points of your discussion?
Yeah, our session will discuss how to control centralized AI or CAI. Many people have pointed out their dangers, and the kind of dangers they point out is those technologies might damage human dignity and freedom of choice and democracy. But the problem is it's perhaps impossible for the humanity to jointly control this risk because those technologies, centralized AI, would bring about a huge profit and power to the winners of this race of development and deployment of centralized AI. The situation is quite different from that of global warming and global nuclear war, where there is no winner. So we'd like to tackle and pursue the solution to this problem.
Another very important topic. Looking forward to it very much. And as to the members of this panel, we have received an unfortunate notice from Mr. Jack Attari. He will not be attending this session due to schedule changes on his side. We're very sorry, but we would like to inform you of this change in advance. Now, once again, to our viewers, please make sure to check the buttons for Channel A and Channel B on the left-hand side of your screen and click to switch over. Language option is also available between English and Japanese. So, are you ready? Let's begin.
Hello, good evening and good afternoon and good morning if you are in the Western Hemisphere. My name is Kazuto Suzuki. I am chairing this panel on the anxiety and among the international relations caused by the progress of science and technology. And as this title indicates, that the progress of science and technology is not only bringing the benefit to the humankind, but also it can be used for the improvement of the military technology, which can increase the anxiety at the international relations. So for discussing this subject, we have a very wonderful panel. We have Dr. Rajeswari, Rajagopalan, we call her Raji, who is the director of the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology at the Observatory Research Foundation in India. And we have Dr. Daniel Porras, Director of Strategic Partnership and Communication at the Secure World Foundation in United States. And also we have Dr. Jessica West, Senior Researcher of the Project Plowshares in Canada. So let me just explain why I set up this, this subject. The progress of science and technology improves the quality of life, utility of social system, and economic activities. However, the scientific knowledge and technological progress may be used for improving the military capabilities and for changing the balance of power. The most of the technologies are dual use, and these technologies can be designed for civilian use, but at the same time, it can be used for the military purposes. And in recent days, the deepening of the International Division of Labor developed a network of global supply chain, which would increase the risk of transferring the sensitive technologies to other countries. Furthermore, the dependence on the supply chain, strategically important goods, to other countries may increase the vulnerability significantly. Thus, the more society depends on the advancement of the science and technology, the more the risks of halting supply chain and the transfer of sensitive technology by international confrontation became serious. If such risks became more serious, it would increase the anxiety among the mind of people, and as a result, the nationalism and hostility may become dominant sentiment among the international society. So the overall theme of this Tokyo Forum is the science and the human minds. And this anxiety, nationalism, hostility, these are also coming through the confrontation at the international relations, and these problems will be the source of the conflict and the further increase of the anxiety of minds. So we are trying to connect the human minds and the science and technology and the international relations in this panel. And I know that this is a pretty difficult task to do, but I'm sure that the three wonderful panelists are capable of doing so, because three of them, we know each other very well through our study on the space programs, as well as the arms control regulations and international governance. So let me just start asking questions. Let's start from Raji. How do you characterize and what is the current status of the rivalry between United States and China? This is where there is a very the heart of the confrontation of the technological competition, and probably not only the civilian part, but also the military part. So how do you assess and what technologies play in such rivalry?
Thank you, Kazuto, and thank you so much for having me at this panel as part of the Tokyo Forum. It's an absolute pleasure to be here among wonderful panelists who are also happy to be friends. So let me start on the question on looking at the state of the play when it comes to the US-China rivalry and the competition. This has, of course, intensified over the past few years. The initial sense that things would improve once the Biden administration is in office, that has not really happened. In fact, much of the Trump administration approach, the hardline approach that we saw towards China and the broader Indo-Pacific, those strategies are being taken forward in a sense. And the American attitude towards China has also become significantly negative in recent years. On account of one, for instance, China's role in the mismanagement and the spread, the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, where you saw some of the multilateral institutions such as the WHO were hijacked by Beijing, developments in Hong Kong, massive human rights violations in Xinjiang. All of this have, in a sense, contributed to a negative perceptions towards China in a big way. But of course, I think the US-China competition and rivalry, they're also a reflection of the changing balance of power dynamics in which you touched upon. Of course, the US continues to be the most dominant power, but its power and influence have waned in relative terms. There is the rise of other power centers, Russia, a re-emergence of Russia, India, China, Japan, and maybe even some of the middle powers, including the EU, Australia, and other countries are coming up, who also have certain niche capabilities, in a sense, in the science and technology area. And each of these powers have their own strength in certain areas. But in overall terms, their capabilities, when you look at it, the US and China continue to be the two powers at the top, with their capabilities, including economic and material power, technological strength, and of course, the military power. We have seen a bipolar world in the past with the US and the Soviet Union, and I'm not too sure we are the entry gate of another one, but there are some differences and similarities from that. The introduction of the new technologies has is an important addition, in a sense, with it in terms of artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, facial recognition, hypersonics, drones, and some of the older technologies such as outer space, missile defense. All of them have a major impact on the strategic dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And today, most major power relations are shaped by technological competition, and the US-China competition being just one example. The geopolitical impact of new technologies has become a compelling reality, especially in this part of the world, in a sense. So like you said, while technologies generally bring prosperity, advancements in societies, but in today's changed geopolitical circumstances, they have also been a source of increasing competition and rivalry. Some of the other tech that we don't talk much about is the development of hypersonic weapons, for instance. And again, these also introduce new uncertainties because, for instance, in the case of hypersonics, these weapons can increase the potential for surprise attacks because of the difficulty of detecting and countering them in a timely fashion. Again, this could lead to a destabilizing arms race spiral between key great powers in the region and all of them who are working on developing these weapons. An additional problem with hypersonic weapons, for instance, is that they erode the line between conventional and nuclear weapons, which will also increase instability. So overall, when I look at it, China's technological advancements have been quite spectacular. The initial thought that they are just stealing technologies, but today they are not only not just innovators of those using those stolen technologies, which in a sense that's happening already, but I think they are also becoming integrating and innovators in a sense. So the way they have, for instance, emerged in the area of artificial intelligence, hypersonic glide vehicles, aircraft carrier, they have again emerged as a leader much faster than what the world expected. Aircraft carrier, for instance, India used to be fairly good at it. But today, China is capable of building double the size of the Indian aircraft carriers on a much faster pace. So China's technological developments have been astonishing. For a long time, the problem of integrating the stolen technology, but today that's no more the case. So I think that's a cause for concern and the anxiety. And for China, I think the technology is not just merely about technology. They could potentially use technology to gain dominance and create some sort of hegemony, which is a political purpose. The purpose of these technologies is not just about development and prosperity, but there is a political purpose underlying this technology development, which is the purpose of dominance and hegemony. And this is dangerous, and how this will play out in the Indo-Pacific is something all of us are watching out. So in a sense, this technology dominance may cause military escalation, and that is something that we need to be mindful of, and how this is going to play out in the Indo-Pacific, because each of the major powers are developing every single technology because they don't want to lose out on a critical national security technology domain, in a sense. So this competition is going to play out. It is going to increase the military Some country may do this for securing themselves, but in the process, it is giving way to more insecurities in the region and beyond.
Right. Thank you very much. That is very comprehensive, but not really sort of a brighter future in the sense that there is potential of further conflicts and possibly, not bright future. But I think that's not what we're trying to achieve here. So what can we do in these circumstances where the China and the United States are competing, and especially the China is developing a capability, as Raji explained, that they are no longer, just mimicking the stolen technologies, but using their own minds and, innovative and integrating their new technologies and, fast-pacing the entire production system. So what can we do? So Daniel, could I ask, what can international society do to mitigate such competition and ease the mind of people? Daniel.
And this is going to be a very difficult task because on the one hand, we are dealing with geopolitics and strategy and all this high-tech, all these high-tech capabilities. And on the other hand, really what we're dealing with are some very simple, fundamental human relationships. As Raji just explained, a lot of the unease that is forming around the technology that we're seeing in outer space is rooted in mistrust. Situations right now between the US and China, the US and Russia, India and China as well, really not great at the moment, as Raji just explained so well. And so it almost doesn't matter what any of the actors are doing in outer space. Everyone is going to assume the worst. We just assume that if China's doing something, the US assumes that they're developing a weapon. It doesn't matter if China provides any data on the contrary, which unfortunately they don't very often. And so that is a situation where we have to try and improve the level of trust that we're seeing. Talking about international society, I would break that down into two camps. So first, we have the official governmental wing of things. What can other governments do? What can other state actors do in order to bring create some guardrails to the technology that's being developed and how it's going to be used? As we have seen with the recent Russian anti-satellite test, you cannot do things in space that will only affect you or that are not going to affect anyone else. The debris that was left over by that test, despite whatever rationale is given, is going to be up there for a really long time. So international society needs to find ways to pressure some of the big major space actors and say, look, we need to have some established norms or guardrails that we're going to work within. And if you're going to get into, if there's going to be conflict or if there's going to be disagreements between parties here on Earth, we can't necessarily let that just move and shift into the space domain, because it could end up in a situation where we all end up losing access to outer space. So certainly in the United Nations level, at the multilateral level, we're seeing a number of efforts and a number of initiatives to try and establish some norms of behavior so that whatever these larger geopolitical powers are doing, they're not going to disrupt things for everyone. And then in addition to that, though, international society also includes lots of other folks like industry, like civil society. 10 years ago, governments were the major actors in outer space, but today it's private companies they hold the majority share of space objects now and operate them. So any new types of discussions that are going to come up are going to require engagement from a number of other actors who have a big stake in what's happening. In addition, I think organizations like the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, like Project Plowshares in Canada and Secure World Foundation in the US, we provide a lot of data. We provide a lot of information for states to be able to make decisions. I think right now at this moment where there is a lot of political desire to see something done in outer space, it's our job as part of civil society to provide objective information, things that leadership and policymakers can use to make informed, substantive decisions on how we're going to rein in our technological developments in outer space. So yeah, it's a really complicated question, but I don't think it's totally hopeless, and that's why we're here. I think the four of us have shared many a drink toasting to optimism.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I think I fully agree that it's not only the governmental officials, it's not those who are engaged in this, state-to-state confrontation, but, there are people like us who are, staying behind the international diplomatic scenes and trying to provide the objective analysis, objective data, and try to warn people that what is really going on and what we shall do. If we don't do certain things, then the world is not going to be the sustainable place. I think the idea, not only the space sustainability, but also the environmental sustainability and the many things. If you let the competition take place, and if you let the competition to take over the entire structure of the international governance, then the only way is to it's going to be the best scenario of the doomsday. So I think what we are doing as an outsider is to provide this objective information and to make people sane decision and to understand what is the consequence of the current activities. So, Jessica, Daniel has mentioned about the role of NGO, and I think the Project ProShare has been working in this domain of providing the objective information as well as the reports like space analytic reports, yearly reports. And I think what ProShare is trying to do is to set up certain norms and to monitor the other member states and other countries following those activities and complying the norms. So how do you see the current state of the compliance of the states to follow the international rules and norms?
Yeah, rules are great in theory, but hard in practice. And just putting rules in place doesn't do a lot to ease anxiety, because the anxiety is always, how do we make sure that other states are complying with the rules? And here I think the type of rules matter, how they're made and where they stem from. This is one reason why there's often a push for legally binding rules, because there's a sense that they instill greater compliance. But these kinds of rules and laws can take decades to agree to, if not longer. And they're possibly not a very good fit with the fast pace at which science and technology is accelerating at the moment. And so Daniel mentioned norms, and I think this is one reason why there's a growing momentum for the creation of norms in many domains of technology, not only outer space, but also cyberspace, artificial intelligence. And I want to walk you through a little bit about what norms are and why I think they're a good place to start if we want to have stronger rules in place that create better technological security. Norms broadly are standards of acceptable or proper behavior, and they're often sort of kind of casually referred to as voluntary rules rather than legal agreements, but they're really so much more than that. When we talk about norms, we're talking about the glue of collective governance, and we really need this glue in place as we enter a more unstable world. They're not just rules. They motivate behavior because they are rooted in shared values and social expectations about what is appropriate. And they have an expectation of compliance because they're rooted in these shared values and objectives. They might not be law, but we expect them to be followed. And we notice when they're not. They're also ubiquitous. You can think about pedestrians flowing through busy urban streets such as Tokyo. There's not many laws that guide individual movements, but there are shared expectations of how we navigate the streets together alongside thousands of other people, orchestrating our flow. And these exist at the international level as well. I think one of the best norms in space is debris mitigation. And here you can see with the recent Russian anti-satellite test, we notice when that norm is violated. And, it creates a strong international reaction. So if the starting place is norms, how do we get there? Because obviously we've just seen sort of an example of norm violation. And I think when it comes with a lot of the emerging technology that we have, we really need to step back and take the time to identify what those shared values and mutual interests are. What do we want to see in place? What is good behavior? And what are the limits? What is unacceptable behavior? Those broad guardrails that Daniel was talking about. And in my field of arms control, there are many examples where you see these being put into practice and being implemented in governance. Principles of non-use have been a powerful driver of bans on weapons of mass destruction. Humanitarian norms of civilian protection have informed restrictions on indiscriminate weapons, such as landmines and cluster bombs. Principles of equality, stability, and non-interference influenced bilateral strategic agreements on arms control. And these exist outside of legal agreements. But how we go about identifying what the new norms are or the old norms that we want to bring into new and emerging technology requires an inclusive process. We need to take the time to nurture and expand cooperation among diverse actors, and we need to build like-mindedness. This is an active, ongoing effort. And I think that is critical to having rules in place that states want to follow. States are not going to follow rules that they don't want to follow. And so we have to think about not just the rules, but how we put them into practice and have compliance. Compliance is tricky, but it's also tricky for law. Usually when we talk about, compliance with norms, the focus is on non-compliance, on, sticks. And one of the biggest sticks is naming and shaming norm violators and bad actors. But sometimes that can not work very well or have a limited effect. We're seeing a lot of naming and shaming following Russia's anti-satellite test. It's not clear what the long-term implications will be. Sometimes I think sticks are double-edged swords and they can be hard to wield effectively. It can also be expensive to try to punish bad behavior. And in a national security context, it can risk escalation of conflict. So I think it's also important to look at the other side of compliance and think about carrots. We need to create benefits and incentives for good behavior. And when we think about the rules for, controlling or managing the flow of technological capabilities, we have to remember it's not just China and the United States. A lot of other states have a stake in these discussions and in this process. The right to access and use technology for peaceful purposes is absolutely essential to all states. And there's often a fear that rules will be used to further exacerbate technological disparities. And I think that provides a really good opportunity to put in place incentives for good practice. You can make compliance with norms and rules a precondition for cooperation. I think we've seen this succeed in other areas, such as the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And it's also the logic behind initiatives such as one we have in Canada on responsible AI. So I guess overall, I'm a little bit more optimistic. I think that we need to adopt a positive approach to norms and to rulemaking to make compliance politically easier and palatable and fruitful for everybody. But this is not easy, and it requires constant engagement and communication.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I think the key word which is emerging here is the norm. And I think you mentioned about the busy street in Tokyo, but I think one of the good example of norms in Tokyo is the escalator. There is sort of a natural behavior, patterns of behavior that the people are standing on left, and that is something quite unusual because in London, New York, people stand on the right. But in Japan, in Tokyo in particular, people stand on the left, and even the officials and the authorities keep saying that you should not stand on the one side, but people are keeping it doing so because they don't want to be named and shamed. They don't want to stand out in the crowd. You don't want to be seen as a norm breaker. And I think this is one of the sort of a power of norm that can influence the decision of the of the behavior. And I think this is also true. For example, China has exercised the ASAT test in 2007, but there was an international condemnation on China. And even though China is not always being very, how do I say, acceptable or recessive to the international condemnation, but ever since China has not exercised the ASAT test, well, at least something of the debris-generating ASAT test. So in that sense, I think, there are this sort of an international condemnation and a naming and shaming may work to some extent. Of course, that's not perfect, and that doesn't guarantee that norms are complied. But I think we need to do both sticks and carrots. And I think Jessica was right that we need to bring some incentives, and particularly for the technological issues. I do agree that the peaceful use of the nuclear energy is one of those carrots for those countries which are not supposed to have the nuclear weapons. So but at the same time, this is going together with the very strict inspection regime by IAEA. And of course, now we are discussing the JCPOA, the Iran case in Vienna, that has broken the norm at one point, and then you have the international agreement to contain the Iranian nuclear activities to the peaceful level, or at least trying to mitigate the threats of Iran to have a nuclear weapon. But because of the Trump administration left the JCPOA, then things are getting backwards to increase the threats. So I think this, again, as Daniel mentioned, that this is the story of the geopolitics and the international relations that is playing on how to manage and how to govern the international, how to govern the safe use or peaceful use of the dual-use technology. So my question to three of you is that, are there any good example other than the nuclear technology? I think Jessica mentioned a couple other things about the AI, but do you come across any interesting case that that international society were able to manage and put certain guardrail to the use of the technology? So I'll start with Raji.
Yeah, thank you, Kazuto. No, I think you said other than nuclear, but I think the NPT stands out as a good example. In a sense, it's one of the universal treaties that has had reasonable success. In a sense, the broad norm of non-proliferation has prevailed for much of these several decades since the treaty came into being. Except, of course, the North Korea has walked out of the NPT, and of course there have been a few violators of the NPT: Iraq, Iran, Libya, and of course North Korea. But so far, except for North Korea, nobody has walked out. And one has seen, in a sense, for instance, 1960s, the Kennedy speech, for instance, where he said there'll be 10 to 20 nuclear weapon states, but that we haven't really seen playing out in a sense. So in a sense, you have only 3 additional states, India, Pakistan, and Israel, that have developed nuclear weapons in a sense. So NPT has, to a large extent, halted that process. There have been additional treaties to boost this particular trend in a sense. Treaties like the SALT, START, and They have also been very, very useful in significantly reducing the number of nuclear weapons to a fraction of what they were during the peak of the Cold War, in a sense. But the key question is, are we in a good space at this point of time to produce more treaties and agreements like that is a key question and a challenge. And of course, the other example is the Outer Space Treaty, for instance. It has held by and large the sanctity of outer space, but I think the treaty came about in a very, very different scenario, in a sense. The kind of challenges, the kind of scenario that's playing out today is not exactly what happened in the 1960s and 70s. So that's the nature of threats having got significantly changed. That's one set of issues. But the more important aspect in general terms, when you look at framing new roles in the road, is that you had 2 or 3 powers engaged in this negotiation exercise in the past, in the 60s and 70s. But today you have a proliferation of actors, not just in numbers, but also the kind of variety of actors that Daniel and had talked about, Daniel and Jessica talked about. You have industry as a major player. How do you bring them in and give them a voice? How do you get their perspective into rulemaking exercise? How do you bring in this civil society into the rulemaking exercise? So the rulemaking exercise, whether it is in terms of developing norms or in terms of legally binding measures, all of that have become much more complicated because there is a large number of actors and you have to bring in some sort of an agreement. You have to be working together to develop some sort of a consensus. And it's not today that there is a lack of agreement on the possible solutions, but it's also disagreement among key powers when it comes to identifying the possible threats and challenges. So some countries believe that it is the arms race that is a big problem, in a sense. Others believe that if you take the case of space debris, and those are the bigger challenges, in a sense. Countries have lost their one and only satellites because it got hit by space debris. So in a sense, for those countries, space debris is a huge problem. Space traffic management, given the kind of rise of mega constellations and kind of things, that's a huge challenge that you're looking at. So it is not only just in terms of the possible solution that there is disagreement about, but also to find some sort of an agreement among states in terms of identifying what the challenges are in the first place. I think that's become hugely problematic, in a sense. And again, these are not because you may still be able to find some sort of consensus among states that, okay, these are a few top 3 challenges, in a sense. But I think there is a larger political problem. The geopolitical conditioning is what is triggering the kind of discord that we see today among the key players. And I'm not sure what. Are we waiting for a major catastrophe to happen in any one of the spheres that you're talking about, whether it is in outer space or in the nuclear domain or artificial intelligence, any or one of these issues, when you look at it, are we looking for a major catastrophe to happen and then recognize the need for framing some rules to regulate our behavior in any of these domains?
Right. I think the last point is extremely important because, at the end of the day, we are in the pretty much unstable and very untransparent in terms of seeing a future. And there's a lot of changes going on, and as you said, there are uncertainty that when you have the space assets, but you may lose it, either because of the collision with debris or being attacked by the other country. So you are facing the 2 different challenges. One is the intentional, geopolitical challenges, and the other is the technical and more, avoidable but very risks that the new technologies are involved. So Daniel, do you have any examples that we can learn from the international governance?
Sure. And I think the examples that we've seen in the past are areas where we've identified common interests and we all said, look, these are just things that we don't want to engage in. So biochemical weapons, for example, we have lots of rules against using biochemical weapons in certain ways, things like poisoning water sources or poisoning the air. These are things that we identified and said, we don't want society to have to deal with these issues. Even though we can do these things, we're not going to. That there have been some violations and that we didn't do a great job of of enforcing our own rules, that's another story. But we have at least been able to come to certain agreements, and we've even done it in outer space. We have the partial test ban treaty or the limited test ban treaty, which says we're not going to detonate nuclear devices in the atmosphere or in outer space or underwater because it's bad for everyone. So in large part, I think what we're trying to do right now is to identify those areas where we all have common interests and what are the carrots and sticks that we might be able to use. Jessica, you've got my mind kind of like churning a little bit right now. And I'm wondering, okay, I think anti-satellite testing is an area where we can all kind of look at it and say, because of the debris that's being generated, this should be a slam dunk. We all have an interest in not generating debris. But now we have the issue of trying to bring others over to this perspective and to having a discussion on this when maybe they've been proposing other things over the last, say, 12 or 13 years. So China and Russia, for example, have been proposing their treaty on the prevention of the placement of weapons in outer space for many years. How do we get them to start talking about something different? And this is where I think Jessica's carrot stick approach could be really helpful. One, the Russian ASAT test, I think, is about to also test a number of legal principles, in particular, the liability convention, questions of due regard, harmful interference. One of my colleagues at Secure World Foundation just put out a legal analysis of the anti-satellite test because it happens to be in orbits that that SpaceX is going to be deploying their mega constellation. And due to the fact that they've already got registrations for a lot of those satellites, he is making the case that perhaps Russia could be sued for all the collision avoidance maneuvers that SpaceX is going to have to do in the future. So there, I think we're going to see some stick. But also for somebody like China, for example, I wonder if the United States couldn't come along and say, hey, this Wolf Amendment that we have that prohibits NASA from doing any work with China? Maybe we can reconsider that if you show that you're a good partner, if you're willing to sign up for something like an anti-satellite test ban, or if you're willing to adopt the Artemis Accords and some of the principles that we're putting in there. Could there be a give and take? I don't know. But I think that kind of negotiation, that kind of big picture thinking is what's needed at the moment. And I think the Biden administration, if nothing else, has shown a willingness to talk about things that in the past were maybe a little bit more taboo. Even just being willing to entertain the idea of a legally binding instrument on anything. The fact that they're talking about an anti-satellite test ban more seriously, I think that shows that there are some new possibilities here.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I mean, in these circumstances, I mean, the U.S.-China relationship, it seems quite unthinkable that the Biden administration is going to give some ways and provide some incentives. But I think this is a sort of a groundbreaking idea, and perhaps because of the tension is so high, then it can work pretty well. I think it is also the case for the nuclear negotiation with Iran today, that because the tension is so high, even the small change will be regarded as a sign of the willingness of making an agreement, moving forward, and then trying to get some achievement in the negotiation. So I think, yes, this is very interesting, and I think you're right that the common interest is the key word. That the building up the norms based upon the common interest will be very strong. I mean, the case of the biological weapon, the chemical weapon conventions, these are the good example that people don't want to see that the nerve gas and the mustard gas will just destroying the humanity. And I think this is not just because it's legal and there is a treaty, legally binding agreement, but also there's a common interest of complying with the rules. So Jessica, could you just elaborate a little bit more on the responsible access to the AI and other things that Canada is promoting on?
Well, AI is my colleague's area of expertise, but no, so it's really in line with what we're seeing at the international level when it comes to norms and this focus on responsibility. But I do want to go back to what makes rules work. And I'm going to draw on sort of two things that come out. Taboos. Taboos are important. And I think that's really what we've been talking about with a lot of this. So we have responsible AI, we have responsible use of space, we have responsible use of cyberspace, but it's really important to know what the limitations are and what things are not acceptable. We have to be very loud and clear on the boundaries when it comes to international governance. And I think that is what has worked so well on nuclear and on chemical weapons. Those taboos are strong. And it's international civil society in particular spends a lot of time maintaining those taboos and keeping them in place as a guardrail. But then the second, what we're really talking about here is not a single agreement with rules where it's either in place or it's not. There's compliance or there's not. And I think where we've moved, especially in international arms control, is more towards these governance regimes where non-compliance has to be part of the process. So yes, we agree on what is responsible. We agree on what the limitations are. There's always lots of gray space in between those huge guardrails. And we've seen far too many bilateral treaties crumble lately because of non-compliance. That's not really an option. We don't have an option to walk away from one another on these issues. Processes to manage compliance, to investigate concerns of non-compliance, to have conversations and to respond as an international community are absolutely essential and have to be part of our process going forward. So, I mean, I'm a student of global governance, and so I see things as, regimes and multiple moving pieces and different actors and different institutions. And I think we have to have that mindset moving forward. It's never about one agreement or one set of rules and either states are complying or they're not. It's in force or it's not. It's really a process of managing one another and coming up with ways to cope with security concerns and to cope with anxiety in a productive way. And so I like the framing of responsible. I like the framing of taboos. And I think we need to also think about how we cope with everything in between.
Yeah. So we are talking about the anxiety of the peace of mind. People's mind is facing this tremendous pressure if they are under certain threats. And if they are facing such a threat, then, the one way, there are a couple ways of thinking. One is be strong and beat the others. When you try to be more superior, then you feel more comfortable that you not be being attacked. But that is typical, the security dilemma situation, that the others will feel more uncomfortable and more anxiety. So at the end of the day, that won't solve any problems. On the other hand, I think there is a difficulties of having the norms and taboos which are shared and understood by everyone at once. So in order to achieve the norms, how is it possible that we can start from the sort of a like-minded or a small group of the countries or a small group of the states that is sharing the same values and then trying to expand it to the international society. So we just have 5 minutes left. So can you just quickly comment on this process of having a like-minded and then to move it from like-minded to the international norms, Raji?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great point. And I think that's where we need to start because, and I think that's something that I wanted to talk about earlier as well. For instance, the US-China rivalry, for instance, technology, competition, all of that has now pushed many states, compelled several states, like-minded states to come together. States like, for instance, Australia, Japan, US, France, India, to come together to help shape a more stable, secure, prosperous Indo-Pacific, and which is in a sense leading to the rise of unilateralism or small exclusive groupings in a sense. This has been, of course, the consequence of weakened multilateralism, multilateral processes where no negotiations are really happening. But the new unilateralism trends that we are seeing today can further weaken multilateralism on the one hand, possibly weakening the multilateral institutions. But I think this is something that we need to deal with. This is a reality we need to deal with. So a cooperation might emerge in certain tech areas, for instance, initially in smaller exclusive groupings. For instance, the Quad joint summit this time in September came out with a statement where for the first time, they talked about developing or consulting each other on norms, guidelines and standards and so on and so forth. And for a country like India, this is in some ways unthinkable because I would not have thought India to agree to a Quad like a small exclusive grouping. But I think that's a reality that we are seeing. But I'm hoping that a grouping of small like-minded countries can come together, build up the momentum, and then gradually take it to expand the group to involve other powers and gradually build up the momentum for truly multilateral negotiations in a sense. So that might be a reality that we have to deal with and process in a sense.
Okay. Daniel.
Thank you, Kazuto. Well, you and I have actually sat through these processes a couple of times and seen what it takes. Yes, I do think that a like-minded group can succeed in developing the momentum to get some norms. But I would draw attention to kind of like the linkage countries and states that are going to make this possible. Because as we've seen over the last 40 years or so, we've got countries on one side and countries on another side, and nobody wants to bridge the gap in the middle between the two positions, between sort of the Western views and then the rest of the world is led by Russia and China. So I think there's going to be a really big role for countries like the UK, like South Africa, Egypt, UAE, Canada, countries like Switzerland or India even, to kind of help bridge the gap between those two divisions that we've seen over so many years, and to say, look, yes, there are interests over there and there are interests over here, but there are certain areas that we can cooperate on, because if we don't, we're all going to lose out. And I think it's going to be very interesting to watch what those countries do over the course of this new UN initiative that has just been taken up, the open-ended working group. I think countries like Brazil and Chile and South Africa, they're going to play a really big role. So we should be keeping an eye on them.
Right. Very exciting time. So finally, Jessica.
Yes, I'm a fan of the saying like-mindedness is a verb and not a noun. It's something we engage in developing with perhaps unlike-minded states and actors. I think the risk of not doing that is fragmented governance, and I don't think that serves anybody. Having different conceptions of what the rules are and different blocks of norms, principles, rules, just leaves us shattered at the end of the day. And I think this is an important change that we saw this week out of the Biden administration with the new space framework, which specifically says, we will engage and cooperate with competitors on governance solutions. And that's a shift from a focus on a very narrow, like-minded states approach. And not that you don't discuss and cooperate and come up with shared approaches amongst close allies and partners, but you have to keep that conversation going with people and organizations and states that might not have a like mind. That's the goal of multilateralism. Right. And we can't lose sight of that.
Yeah. Perfectly agree. So that's all we have time for today, and we can discuss that all night. But unfortunately, we have to end at some point. But I think we have come up with a lot of interesting ideas, norms, and taboos, and guardrail. And finally, we need communication. That is the way to solve and overcome the problem of the anxiety generated from the progress of science and technology. And without communication, without sharing the idea and values, we can't really be happy to see the progress of the humankind and human minds. So I'll close this panel. I thank all the wonderful panelists, Raji, Daniel, and Jessica, for coming here and make a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, sincere thanks to all of our speakers for another round of great discussions. After a short break, we will move on to the final session of this year's Tokyo Forum. We'll be back in a few moments, so please stay with us.